Greetings and salutations. My name is Michael Schwahn, and this is your one-take review of Crisis Core Reunion Final Fantasy VII. Now, as a disclaimer, the biggest disclaimer that I can offer is that when it comes to Final Fantasy, I am a tool, okay? I am a absolute tool when it comes to this franchise. If it has the words Final Fantasy on it, I've probably already bought it, and it's not always a good product, but I can't help myself, okay? I'm sorry. That's just who I am, and I really have just a soft spot for Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy VII, of course, is my favorite game, probably of all time. It's been a part of my life basically forever. I have this nice, lovely story of how I got introduced to Final Fantasy VII, which I'm not going to share with you here. And even Crisis Core itself is special to me. My very first paycheck that I got from a job that I paid taxes out of, to where I actually got a pay stub and had to take it to the bank and stuff. My very first paycheck, I took that paycheck and I spent the entire paycheck on a PlayStation Portable. And then I could do nothing with it until my second paycheck, when I was actually able to pick up a copy of Crisis Core. And so Crisis Core also is something that's near and dear to me. So just letting you know, my bias exists. I played an absurd amount of it, to the point that I was trying to lay my PSP down on the desk on the other side of my textbook so that I could play it in class without getting noticed. It did not work, but I tried. But I haven't really replayed it much since then. I played it a lot at that point in time. I never really replayed it ever. I did still have lots of nostalgia going into Crisis Core. I remembered playing it and I was like, oh man, they've done so much with it. I'm so ready. Now I will say, I'm going to do my best to avoid significant spoilers for both Crisis Core as well as Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy VII Remake as we go into this. So let's go ahead and get started. So the premise/story of Crisis Core is that it is a prequel to Final Fantasy VII. As you go through Final Fantasy VII, you're going to see several flashbacks of events that happened before that game is taking place, and Crisis Core covers most of those flashbacks and more. It expands on the world of Final Fantasy VII. It expands on the stories in those flashbacks. Primarily, we are following along Zack Fair, who starts the game out as a soldier second class and becomes a soldier first class along the way. He's one of the best known backstory characters. He's a very important character to the backstory of Cloud himself, as well as Aerith, if you're familiar with those characters from the core Final Fantasy VII. But it expands even more than that. It expands on known characters. The main villain of Final Fantasy VII is Sephiroth, and we get to see kind of the rise and fall of him descending into madness in Crisis Core. We get to see the backstories of Cloud and Tifa and Aerith and Yuffie, and see a little bit more of where they were at before the actual game started. There's small hints and mentions of other characters, but they don't get nearly the amount of expanded backstory that the named characters that I just rattled off do. Now, there's also some new characters that are introduced in Crisis Core. Angeal, who kind of focuses like Zack's mentor and is the heart of soldier. That said, I will say that Angeal, of all of the new characters, largely, he feels the most offset. He's there to be the mentor role for Zack and not much else. Everyone else, whether they are a already existing character that's getting a backstory or newly introduced characters, he's the one that feels the weakest, even though I don't feel like he should be. Next up is Genesis, the main villain of Crisis Core. You've probably seen something along of his at some point. He's got the big red jacket on. He's got the hair. He's modeled after Gact, who's a freaking J-pop star. And he's always preaching about Loveless, the play that is shown off multiple times through the entirety of Final Fantasy VII. By shown off, I mean we get to hear it and see a poster for it, but we never actually get the entirety of Loveless anything at all. That said, I will say, I remember, like most people, really disliking Genesis when I played Crisis Core. And when we went through Crisis Core Reunion, I'll say that he's a lot better than I remember. And maybe it's because just I'm so much different of a person than I was, oh God, so many years ago, 15 years ago, when Crisis Core originally released, right? And so my tastes and everything have probably changed a lot since then. And so Genesis was much more tangible of a person than he was 15 years ago. And then the next one is Cisne. She is a Turk and kind of is like meant to be almost like an extra love interest for Zack, where you can tell that maybe she has something of a feeling for him, but Zack's such a lovable idiot that he doesn't realize that like anyone has feelings for him ever. And Cisne was the character that I was most excited to see in Reunion because I remember really liking Cisne a lot. And after getting through Reunion, she has a much smaller role than I remember. I remember being really excited to see her in Reunion, and then I got through the game, and you don't see her nearly as much as I feel like she exists in my memory. But Cisne is the character that I'm still very much hoping that we get to see more of as the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy continues, because she was obviously created after the original game, so she doesn't exist in the original game, but she could exist now in the Remake trilogy, but we'll have to wait and see. There's a few added additional smaller side characters: Dr. Hollander, Director Lazard, a soldier named Kunsel. I'm not going to talk much about them, but there are new players that exist within this game. And the game ultimately talks about the collapse of Soldier and sets up the entire premise of what happens for the rest of the Final Fantasy VII compilation. Really, a whole bunch of parts of the rest of the entirety of all the games, of all of the series, whether it's Advent Children, the movie, Dirge of Cerberus, so much of that is rooted in the events that take place in Crisis Core. And so it's neat to see kind of where it all came from, even though this isn't actually where Final Fantasy VII started. Now, the game is available on, I think, basically all platforms. It's available on PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo Switch, and Steam, which also means it's on the Steam Deck. So basically everything besides your mobile phone. We did play the game on Steam. I played it on computer. We streamed the entire thing. I have a Ryzen 9 5900X, 32 gigabytes of RAM at the time of playing, and an NVIDIA RTX 3070 Ti. So I'm not working with lower end equipment, but it's what I played it on, so it's what we're going to talk about. I played it at 1440p at a 60 FPS, and at least with my system, it was just locked at that. There was no issues. The game ran great. Now, I will say, even though with high-end hardware where you can really brute force some things, if a game isn't programmed well, you still can't brute force it all the time. You'll see frame drops. You'll see just like it trying to struggle to even brute force it because the game just isn't optimized well. I didn't have that issue here. The game looked great and it played great. Now, as we already talked about, this is kind of like a remaster, but it's a little bit more than that. This game originally released on the PlayStation Portable back in 2007/2008, depending on where you were in the world. And while it is technically a remaster, they use the base framework, the level design, the skeletons for the animations and everything. They also put a lot more into it. It's got new backgrounds and recreated textures, completely new voice acting. They overhauled elements of the game, whether it's the menus, the UI, the way the gameplay actually functions, implementing things that they learned from Final Fantasy VII Remake or mechanics they have from Final Fantasy VII Remake, like the Punisher mode, which I don't remember existing as a mechanic in the original release. Now, mind you, it's been humming a number of years, but they've built on this remaster. They didn't just shove the entire game into an upscaler, put the textures up to an upscaled 4K, remastered the audio by just shoving it through a filter and compiling it and hoping that it'll work and shoving it out the door. There was work that went into this remaster to where it's like more than a remaster, but it's not a full remake because they did use so many existing assets. I don't know what to call it. It's still the same structure of a game, but and you can definitely tell that when you're playing it because it's a 2008 PlayStation Portable game, and you can feel that kind of when you're getting into it. But there's so much that they did to modernize this game that we just don't see with most remasters, where it's just exactly the same game. It just hopefully looks a bit better and hopefully runs a bit better, but even that isn't guaranteed. But the game does play better. This game is an action hack and slash RPG. You got a spammable basic attack, some abilities that are acquired through the trademark, a MacGuffin of Final Fantasy, which is materia. And you also have an RNG mechanic of the digital mind wave. Anytime you see combat of this game, you'll see in the far corner a roulette wheel that's spinning. That's the digital mind wave. It's meant to represent Zack's feelings and emotions and memories as he's fighting in battle, and that's kind of what pushes him forward. He thinks of his friends, the people that inspire him, his fellow soldier and stuff like that, and that pushes him to fight farther. It's how he gets his limit breaks. It's how you summons and stuff. And so you have these mechanics. And Crisis Core in the past is plagued with pauses, is the way that I guess is the best way to describe it. Combat can be really non-responsive in the original Crisis Core, to the point that abilities would trump almost everything else, because certain abilities would have a stronger chance of stuttering your opponent, and those abilities were what you wanted because you just did not have the ability to respond in any meaningful way, in a timely way back then. The best one, I forget what it was called. It was just fucking Cloud. It was just Zack stomping, right? But that stomp would almost stutter any enemy. And so that ability, that was the best ability in the game, because it would stagger almost any enemy, make them stutter, interrupt their attack. You could beat the whole game once you got the materia. You could beat the final boss. You could beat the super boss. Just stomp your bitch, right? You can't do anything. And unfortunately, that felt a lot like the right way to play, because you didn't have a more seamless, flowing, integrated combat. And the digital mind wave, whenever it would trigger, would pause combat as a whole. Everything would stop, the mind wave would take over the screen and show you what your results were, and it felt awful. Now, the remaster fixes all of that and even builds upon and improves it. Combat flows really, really well. There's no slowdown, it doesn't pause for the digital mind wave anymore. By comparison, it feels fantastic. But we're not going to be strictly talking about how this game compares to its original release. We need to take a look at how this game is on a standalone, how it stands on its own. And the combat feels good, and it looks good, but this combat really lacks a lot of depth, okay? I will say we played on normal, and you can just spam attacks a lot. And really, if you know what an enemy's weakness is or know a way to stagger them, that still is just the ipso facto way to just take out any enemy. Few enemies feel like a balanced challenge. Either they're an easy win or a hopeless defeat. You are either just going to trounce over these enemies like they don't exist, or you're going to feel like they're an insurmountable wall, and there is so little that exists in the space between those two settings in combat. There also isn't a whole lot of engagement that you would see with games that look like this. This game looks like it's trying to be a character action game or a spectacle fighter. Think of games like Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, Nier Automata, but it doesn't function like those games. You don't have things like perfect dodges. You do have a block and a dodge, but they are slow. It's not trying to be this fast, hacky, slashy style game, but it's also not slow like a true turn-based game. It exists in this weird space between the two, to where like you feel a little bit more like energized, like you're doing more, like you're engaging with the game on a faster pace than a turn-based game does, but it's not exciting in the way that a spectacle fighter is, to the point that it just exists and it doesn't do anything that's truly outstanding or memorable. It looks good and it feels alright, but it just doesn't leave any imprint on the player as you're getting through it. It's serviceable, but that's about as far as it can go. Not bad, not good. And one of the things that is really important in this, though, is the actual content of the game. This game's story, the actual story, is maybe 4 hours. And I mean maybe, okay? And it does expand on the flashbacks from Final Fantasy VII, but honestly, it does that very, very little. For the most part, you're not going to be learning a whole lot of new information by playing Crisis Core. But what it does have are these side missions. You go to a save point or to the mission tab, and there's these side missions that you can load into, and some of them have story in them. Like, you can see a lot of Yuffie's story in there and how Yuffie develops as a character, but it's minimal. It is so small. There's some side stories that are completely meaningless, but there's 300 of these, okay? The game, if you wanted to complete it, takes like 60 hours. And 55 of those hours are doing these side missions, okay? And most of it is just running through hallways, fighting throwaway enemies. It's a long slog if you want to do this. And there's honestly very little excitement or variety that exists within these side missions. And the problem is that the lack of depth in combat means that the excessive mission bloat really overshadows the core playthrough if you spend too much time with them at the wrong times. So if you spend too much time doing the missions before you've beaten the game, then one, it's going to make the story really dragged out and disconnected, and it's going to level you and get you power-ups in a way that the story is just not challenging at all. And so it's best to like do some of them, because there's definitely some things that you want out of them, like accessory slots and shops and stuff that are unlocked through these missions. But really, it's better if you hold the majority of them for post-game. But if you try to play them all post-game, it's going to wear you the fuck out, because they're so samey and so repetitive that it really will start to showcase just how little depth exists in the combat. And that's a struggle. It's a painful struggle, to the point that I didn't get through them all. I will say I got through all of them back in 2008 or 9 or whatever, but I was not willing to do it again at this point in time, because it was just too much. It was too much. Now, one thing I'll also talk about is we need to talk about several different pieces of the audio soundscape, okay? Square Enix, on a historical level, they are, with limited exception, master of two things: visuals and audio, okay? Square Enix Squaresoft and then Square Enix was known for the longest time of trying to push whatever platform they were on to its absolute limits, make the most beautiful game possible on the hardware that they had available. And they're also masters of audio, okay? Especially when it comes to their music. But it even goes beyond their music. This game, when you're playing it, it sounds really good. Zach's abilities, they got this nice, real chunky effect to it. Like, you can really feel the crackle of the lightning as he's like, doing these like spinning lightning attacks and stuff. It really adds a lot of dynamic effect to this combat that otherwise doesn't have its own depth in it, all right? And then, of course, Final Fantasy as a whole normally has really, really brilliant music. The original Final Fantasy VII soundtrack was by Nobuo Uematsu, and this soundtrack feels like an evolution of the original soundtrack from Final Fantasy VII, of we're going to take all these tracks and we're going to just see what else we could do with them, if there's ways to build upon them. And it feels good. It feels different from the original tracks, while still having that like nostalgia wave that hits you when you hear it. And it's interesting though, because it also can just feel like the same music. The other thing that we need to touch on though is the voice acting, okay? Because that was one of the pieces of controversy leading up to this game's release, is that they redid a whole lot of the voice work, including most of the characters getting completely new voice actors. And one of the ones that they talk about the most is the main character, Zack Fair. Because Zack Fair in the original release had a pretty damn good voice actor. The new voice actor, a lot of people don't like. But I will say that when it comes to voice work in a video game, so much of that is about direction. These games are 15 years apart, and I don't know right offhand if they have the same vocal directors, right? And directors can have different visions and want different things from different people. And so the time gap between these, they might have had completely different directions given to them. You can have a good voice actor, but give them bad voice directing, and you will get a bad performance. Now, it'll be better than a bad voice actor with bad direction, but you stay with me here. If you have a bad voice actor with good direction, you can get a pretty decent performance if you have a good director that is willing to get the performance that they want out of that less talented voice actor. And I think that's kind of what's happening here. So Zack, as a character, always kind of felt like a big puppy to me. He's this big, lovable guy with a heart of gold, and he's just this character of innocence that just doesn't like to accept that there are wrongs in the world that he can't fix, and there's people that he can't help. And I definitely feel like the new voice actor captures that energy better. Do I think the old voice actor was a stronger raw talent? I do. I think that they were a stronger raw talent. But they were scruffier and more aggressive, to where Zack sounded angry more often. He had kind of a rough tone on that scratchy throat, right? And the new guy, he's more jovial, he's upbeat, which is how I have always perceived Zack, of this really happy-go-lucky, almost like carefree person that just wants to do the right thing and be the right person to help people where he can. And I think ultimately at the end of it, it'll be completely about preference. A lot of people get really heavily into their nostalgia, and if something isn't the way that they remember it, they push it away like a kid that's being told that they need to eat broccoli. And I wasn't in that position, right? I was really happy to see a new performance, and it helps that I liked the performance. And ultimately, at the end of it, I like both, but for different reasons. But I think, again, that the new one captures Zack a lot better as a character. Now, as we close this out, I will say that Crisis Core, really what it's going to be for me, Crisis Core Reunion, this game is going to define a new level of a remaster, wholly. But the problem is that very select titles can do this. You can't do what Square Enix did with Crisis Core Reunion with every game that exists. This just happened to be positioned in like the correct space in the universe for them to be able to use so much of their old content and recreate and rebuild it into what we get today. You can't do that with every title depending on what it was built for, what console it released on and stuff. And so this is just a really golden scenario where this was able to happen. Would I like to see people do these more than a remaster but not quite a remake with more titles? Absolutely I would. But I don't believe that it is possible for the vast majority of games that exist out there. And really, this will likely exist forever as the definitive edition of Crisis Core. It'll be the best way to play it. It's been really needed because the original game is still a PSP exclusive. There's not a platform that you can play it on. You would need outside of emulators, but so you would need a PSP and you need to find a copy of it, and that's continuing to get harder and or more expensive. It'll make for a really good entry point for both the original Final Fantasy VII as well as people that want to go from this into Final Fantasy VII Remake. Overall, Crisis Core Reunion is a good experience, but I will say it is flatter and shallower than I remember. And that could just be those rose-colored glasses of being young and having less games to play and less games under your belt as a gamer and experiences that you've gone through. But I'll say, as a product, strictly as a product, as an example of this new tier of remaster, of more than a remaster and lower than a remake, it's like a fucking 10 out of 10. The work that they did with this game, fucking incredible, okay? But as a game, your experience with it, I think, is going to be wholly dictated on the mission structure and how you approach it and how many of those you do and win. It's a really good, solid single playthrough, and if you do just kind of take a measured approach to those missions to be able to progress through the story, the combat holds up really well before that shallowness starts to show when you just start to grind through the missions. The missions, I think, are a little bit too much of the overall package. This game, in terms of overall gameplay and content, has very, very little outside of grinding through 300 missions that are all just side content filler. That said, this game looks great. It doesn't have really any performance issues. I love the sound in it. It plays well. And I think that this is a game that is priced appropriately. It's $50 brand new, and you can get it on sale. I think it's worth the price and the time. If you want a number, I would give this game a really solid 8 out of 10. I think that it really could change that score depending, though, on how you, again, experience the game. So, because if you do too many missions at the wrong time, you could drop this game down to like a 6. But I knew that going into it, so I was like, all right, we're going to do this. We're going to get through these missions to unlock this summon and this shop and these accessory slots, and then we're just going to keep going with the story. Okay, now we need to go here. And so I made this game a better experience for myself because I had the knowledge of when to make it a better experience, but you could easily harm that experience for yourself, and I can't really give you any good guidance on how to do that. You just kind of need to fill it out. Maybe someone made a guide for it. So those are my thoughts. What are your thoughts? Have you played the original Crisis Core? Have you played Crisis Core Reunion yet? Are you here just trying to see if it's worth your time? If you have played Reunion but not the original, how did you find it? And you've played both, how do you feel about it? Are you upset with the new voice acting, or are you fine with it along the same way I am? I'd love to hear from you. you. Please leave your thoughts down in the comments below. We got 2 upcoming reviews. We're going to be reviewing Resident Evil 2 Remake as well as Forspoken, another game from Square Enix that's going to be an interesting one to talk about because it has its own controversies in it. So be sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to catch those. If you like this video, please leave it a like. And just keep in mind that we do stream on Twitch. We stream there 4 days a week. I would love to see you there. And if you go watch one of the other videos on the channel, or if I see you in the live stream, thank you and enjoy.